Okay, welcome everybody to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. Very happy to have Tim Bartley here, who's going to speak about perception of distant problems, popular understanding of labor and environmental problems in global supply chains. So Tim is, quite recently, he's now a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology at Stockholm University. But before that, prior coming to Stockholm, he has been on the faculty of Washington University in St. Louis, Ohio State University, and Indiana. And he received his PhD at University of Arizona. And he has written extensively about the organizational, political, and sociology of economics, with a particular interest in globalization, labor, and the environment. Quite recently, a book, Rules Without Rights, Land, Labor, and Private Authority in the Global Economy, Oxford University Press, 2018. And also a paper that I haven't read, but I would like to read, Transnational Cooperation in Global Governance. So very welcome.
Thank you so much, Gustav, and I'll send you the paper. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for having me. It's really nice to be with you all. As Gustav said, I've just been in Stockholm since August after spending the bulk of my career in the U.S. And I've been here to the Institute a couple of times to meet with Malcolm, but very happy to meet more of you and to have a chance to tell you about this research. Here's the big question that I'll try to address today. How do people perceive the moral boundaries of markets? That is, what should and should not be bought and sold? When do they think it's important for the state to restrict the boundaries of markets? And especially, how does this work when objectionable features of a market are not proximate to the observer but distant? This distancing, I'm going to argue, is important in a world of global supply chains that we live in. Of course, global supply chains have very much been at the center of attention over the past couple of years, primarily for their dysfunctions and their bottlenecks. But even when they work as intended, one of the things that global supply chains do, and arguably their purpose, is to externalize environmental damage and labor exploitation to places that are far away from the point of consumption. So, for example, supply chains for electronics externalize dangerous work and pollution of local environments to sites of manufacturing and resource extraction that are distant from many end users of the products. And supply chains for leather and cattle more broadly produce so-called imported deforestation for people in Europe and North America. So my interest in this talk is how people on the consumption end perceive these kinds of distant problems. In particular, under what conditions do observers see it as important to restrict markets to address labor and environmental problems in global supply chains? And specifically, when do they see state intervention as necessary to do this? This also means asking how people perceive the responsibilities of transnational corporations that coordinate and in many ways control these global supply chains, as well as competing frames offered by advocacy organizations, the two most central players in this contested arena. So what I'm going to show you concretely are results from two survey experiments that I've done with collaborators. The first in the US, which is the foundation of an article that's coming out soon in the American Sociological Review. And the second in Germany, which we're still working to make sense of, and I can use a lot of ideas that are developed here for making sense of that data and writing that paper. So first, let me give you a little bit of background on how I got to this point. So I'm an economic sociologist, and one of the things that economic sociologists have done is to emphasize the way in which moral frames shape perceptions of markets. The so-called morals in markets or moral market literature in economic sociology is where people like Viviana Zelizer, Marion Fourcade, and others have argued that perceptions of commodification, of valuation, and of market restriction are filtered through historically and situationally defined moral lenses that can shift based on how people understand the structure and the cultural meaning of a market exchange. This kind of basic insight in economic sociology is quite different from the way in which scholars of globalization have gone about measuring attitudes and perceptions of globalization. Where scholars, particularly in political science, typically measure preferences about globalization through a lens of stylized pro-trade, pro-free trade preferences versus so-called protectionist attitudes of wanting to restrict international trade. So part of what we're trying to do here is to bring this moral markets literature into the realm of perceptions of globalization as an alternative frame to thinking just about trade and protectionism. A second reason that we're interested in this, and particularly we're interested in perceptions of the state in global supply chains, is that over the past decade, a little more than a decade, state intervention in global supply chains is increasing. Now, some of this happens through new rounds of tariffs and trade wars, but it also includes a variety of new regulations that in which states address or attempt to address environmental, labor, and human rights issues in global supply chains. From bans on forced labor, which have been geared in part toward human rights abuses in Xinjiang, China, against Uyghur minorities, labor and modern slavery, bans against products made with illegal logging or traceable to illegal logging, and now potentially bans against products that can be traced to deforestation more broadly. This is just a little documentation of what we see as the rise of this kind of state intervention into environmental and labor conditions in global industries. So on one hand, trade agreements between governments have increasingly included provisions related to environmental standards and labor standards. But also, in the US at least, we see rising enforcement of bans against forced labor, which is this line, and enforcement against international environmental crime, which is this line, both of which have seen upticks over the past decade, or in the case of forced labor, really over the past 3 years. Finally, the other reason that we're interested in this topic of preferences for state intervention, and particularly how those are shaped by what corporations do and what corporations say, is that the predominant response to problems of labor exploitation and environmental degradation in global supply chains has been to build private, voluntary initiatives in which companies promise, for reputational reasons, to set and enforce standards for their global supply chains. And a wide array of research now has shown that at best, these standards fall short of their promise, and at worst, they actually have very, very small effects, if any, on the problems they were intended to produce. And this is the genre that my earlier work, the book that Gustav mentioned, fits in, where I looked at what these kinds of standards for sustainable forestry and fair labor conditions look like on the ground, in my case in Indonesia and China, but this is one of a range of studies that have demonstrated some of the limits of private voluntary initiatives. So we want to understand perceptions of the state in the midst of competing voices, distant problems, and a moment where it seems like the state may be able to address some of the failures and limitations of an earlier wave of voluntarism and private regulation. Oh, I should say, I don't know what the norms are. If you want to ask questions as I go, that's totally fine with me, or we can wait till the end, whatever works best for all of you. All right, I'm going to quickly dive into the research here because I do want to try to tell you about both the American and the German data that we collected. Yeah.
Okay, so you talk about state interventions, and as examples you use legislation in the US, for example.
Ah. Sorry if I...
this is a very
yeah.
short question. So, but also the EU, so that's they also provide state intervention of the relevant kind. What about global institutions, all sorts of governance institutions? That's what you're talking about.
Like, for instance, international organizations.
Yeah, right. The
Yeah.
UN or whatever, in the UN system.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, those organizations have been involved in the past in promoting voluntary initiatives and in shaping voluntary initiatives. And their power, their more direct power is more about creating norms than it is about directly regulating. And so what I think we're seeing now is a situation where states are actually setting quite hard penalties for things like illegal logging and forced labor that those international organizations don't really have the power to enforce. There's another story about the WTO could, but the WTO has not wanted to get involved in these issues, particularly labor issues. But whereas on environmental issues, they've taken a somewhat narrow path, I think. All right, so what we've done is, a conjoint survey experiment in which we can see how a variety of different elements shape people's judgments about the conditions under which it's important for, in our case, in this first case, the US state to intervene in global supply chains. And what's neat about a conjoint experiment is that you can randomize lots of different things and then see essentially the effect of each of those randomized elements on a choice to prefer regulation in a particular case, but also the extent of people's preferences for or against regulation. That is, whether they support or oppose state intervention in a particular setting. So we randomize a whole array of different things. Different labor and environmental problems, such as dangerous work. These are problems that are commonly found in global supply chains. Modern slavery, water pollution, toxic emissions, depletion of natural resources in supply chains for clothing, electronics, and seafood. And then we also generated some advocacy frames and corporate assurances of responsibility to see how these competing messages in this contentious kind of discursive field shape people's perceptions of when the state should intervene or not. And this involves basically creating a whole array of conditions that can be fully randomized. It's both the challenge and the fun of doing this kind of survey experiment is we have to have problems and frames that apply to the different products and to the different problems in equally plausible ways. I'll show you what this looked like in just a second. Yeah.
Maybe connects a question of clarification. So this is a question about regulation, state regulation, not about their preference about dangerous work or getting projects that are produced that way.
So our attempt here is to ask people a simple question: should the product be banned or not? And that gets at it's based on both their understanding of state regulation, but also an indicator of whether they think the problem is severe enough to justify that state regulation. And because we're doing this experimentally, for the most part, we're setting aside people's underlying preferences for more or less state regulation. Although I'll show you some results later that go further with that.
Some people think it's important that you know about how they're produced, and maybe they don't care about state regulation.
So it's possible, and particularly we'll see, as I show you the effects of corporate assurances of responsibility, we'll see how even issues that people potentially care a lot about, they might not see as relevant for states to be involved in some circumstances. So what we ask respondents to do is to decide when it's most important for the US government to intervene. And we have this simple kind of policy intervention that's intuitive and resonates with the idea of market restriction from economic sociology. That is to simply ban the sale of items in the US that come from problematic suppliers. That is, suppliers where there's been evidence of these problems. We did this survey experiment for using a sample of about 4,500 US residents just before the COVID pandemic struck back in February and early March of 2020. And we pre-registered our analysis and our hypotheses, so we're not just fishing for results. We had specific hypotheses, and I'll show you the results of at least some of those hypothesis tests. So here's one way that we presented this information to people. We started out by showing them a vignette in which they get a particular problem and product, well, in this case, modern slave labor in the production of clothing. And we show them a statement from American businesses who have voluntarily decided to say, in this case, a large retailer, we've adopted strict new rules to prevent this problem and are closely monitoring our suppliers' compliance. This is a kind of assurance of private regulation, as well as a frame from a major advocacy group, in this case saying corporations might say they're taking responsibility, but they only want to cover up their relentless pursuit of profits, which is the root of the problem. And what we're able to do then is see how each of these factors shapes people's judgments. After showing them one scenario in this form, we then show them a second scenario in the same form. And then we show them, as is common in a conjoint survey experiment, a comparative table. I've left out the details here, so we don't have to read too much. And then we asked them, if you had to choose between these two scenarios, in which one would you most want the US government to take action to impose a ban? That, of course, forces them to choose one. They might not want intervention in either case, or they might want it in both cases. So after that, we then asked them to rate the importance of state intervention in each scenario on its own. Do you think the US government should impose a ban? And they rated their response on a scale from definitely should not to definitely should, with a midpoint of not sure. And we're going to look at both of these outcomes when I show you the results here. All right. So one sort of hypothesis that we're interested in here is how statements that corporations make about their responsibilities and attempts to privately regulate their suppliers shape perceptions of state intervention. So we test this idea that when corporations provide assurances that their suppliers are being privately regulated, this would reduce the perceived importance of state intervention. So one way that companies could do that is through a statement like this, which is the same one that you saw. But we're also interested in kind of pushing this and seeing how far we can go. As we vary the credibility of these statements, what happens? If we shift to simply pro-social language, in which companies say nice things but don't really promise to do anything concretely, does that still shape people's understandings and judgments of whether the state should intervene or not? So here's the statement that we'll test there. As I mentioned, this is a crowded and contentious discursive arena. So we want to show people corporate statements as well as statements from advocacy organizations. And drawing on the literature on transnational advocacy networks, we created really 4 types of statements here that draw on frames of science, testimony, or 2 different kinds of anti-corporate critique. And we expect those to boost interest in state intervention. All right, the piece that I want to actually talk the most about here is understandings of the problems. That is, there are different kinds of environmental problems, different forms of labor and exploitation and environmental degradation. And what should we think? What should we expect to find in terms of which problems will generate the greatest interest in a ban? Well, this is not very clear a priori. That is, we didn't find a lot of theoretical guidance as to whether people would be more worried about environmental problems, labor problems, or some subset or mix of the two. We developed 2 kind of tentative hypotheses around issues of sacredness and illegality. Namely, that problems that violate sacred categories of childhood and personhood should kind of be at the upper end of concern. That is, problems of child labor and forced labor or modern slavery should strike observers as especially objectionable. Drawing on research on environmental crime, we also argue that when problems are defined as illegal or criminal, as is common in the case of illegal logging, illegal fishing, illegal mining, this should also boost interest in state intervention as compared to products that are similar problems described without that kind of illegality, criminality frame. But a lot of our insight into the problems comes not from a priori hypotheses, but from us trying to make sense of people's open-ended responses. Because after asking people to choose between the scenarios, we also asked them to write in their own words why they made that choice. And this turns out to provide some revealing clues as to how people are understanding these different problems. And I'll come back to that evidence in just 1 second. All right, before I show you a bunch of results, let me give you a rough sense of how I want to show you these results. So we have 2 different, if I move over here, I guess that's okay. We have 2 different measures of our outcome variable. One is whether people prioritize a scenario for state intervention, and the other is how much they support state intervention in that particular case. And I'm going to show you the effects of each of these elements on each of those 2 outcomes. And the important thing to look for here is, does the line that I'm going to show you cross the 0 line or not? I'm going to show you an estimate of the average marginal component effect. This is like a regression slope with a confidence interval, a margin of error around it. If that confidence interval touches the 0 line, that means it's non-significant. If it's off the 0 line, that means we have a statistically significant causal effect, since this is an experimental design. All right, so let me show you, start with corporate promises, corporate assurances. We'll move to advocacy frames, and I'll show you the problems in just a second. So, basically, any way in which companies promise or provide assurances that they're privately regulating their suppliers leads people to see state intervention as less important. So that happens through this strict rules kind of condition in which companies say we've adopted strict new rules to prevent this problem. It also happens to a similar extent when companies engage in so-called multi-stakeholder partnerships to certify that their suppliers meet strict standards for responsible production. And interestingly, although the research on global standards tends to think of these multi-stakeholder standards as having more credibility than a kind of unilateral corporate statement, there's no difference in the effects of these kinds of statements. That is, they both affected judgments about the state to a similar degree. The pro-social statement, on the other hand, does not really matter. That is, people do see through that. There's a difference between statements of concrete private regulation and simple statements of pro-social language in the way they're perceived. The advocacy frames mattered somewhat less consistently. Here we see positive effects on the right side of the zero line here, but only some of which are statistically significant. So when advocacy organizations made these anti-corporate claims that companies are really just covering up their relentless pursuit of profits, it did increase people's preferences or interests in state intervention. But some of the other frames didn't actually make consistent differences. The scientific frame did matter to a slight degree, a little bit more inconsistently. But this frame in which we try to simulate some kind of testimony from an affected individual, the anonymous JN, who says this has caused great suffering for me and my community, this didn't actually consistently produce a change in preferences for state intervention. That is, there's a marginally significant effect here, but a non-significant effect on the overall degree of support. All right. We can also look at whether different people with different political beliefs responded differently to these kinds of statements. And this, to some degree, gets at Gustav's question about sort of preferences for regulation as opposed to just concern. Advocacy frames only work for moderates and liberals. People on the conservative end of the political spectrum did not respond to them, or in one case actually became less supportive of state intervention when an advocacy organization said, we really need the state to intervene here. It was sort of a backlash effect. On the other hand, corporate assurances of private regulation basically worked for everyone. They reduced the perceived importance of state intervention across the political spectrum, liberal to conservative, and also across the spectrum of a question we asked about regulation in general. So even so-called true believers in regulation, people who think that state regulation is generally beneficial, become less supportive of state regulation when companies say, we'll take care of it. There's a kind of deference to corporate assurances here that happens essentially for everyone. All right, in terms of problems, we find 4 problems out of the 9 that we showed people that stick out. 2 environmental and 2 labor. So as we expected, child labor and modern slavery are among the most, or provoke the highest level of concern, highest level of interest in state intervention, measured in terms of prioritization or degree of support. But also, emission of toxic chemicals and pollution of rivers and oceans generated high levels of support, high levels of interest in state intervention as well. Others, like overuse of natural resources, in spite of the fact that that's one of the things that concerns many of us in this room, provoked quite low levels of interest in state intervention, among the lowest. On the other hand, when it was framed in terms of illegality, that raised the level of state intervention, the level of interest in state intervention slightly, although it's still quite low compared to most of these other problems. I'm going to talk in a second about how we might make sense of some of these patterns and the frames through which people understood them. By the way, these problem effects are bigger than the effects of corporate statements or advocacy frames. So in some ways, what people are paying the most attention to in our scenarios is the problem and they're thinking through whether it's severe, whether it's relevant to them, and whether it's worthy of a quite strong state response, that is to ban a product from being sold. All right, let me show you now some of the qualitative evidence that we collected by asking people to justify or explain their decision about when state intervention was needed. One person, for instance, said, to me, pollution is something that affects everybody, and that's why I chose scenario 2. The other, which was dangerous working conditions in this case, is more concentrated into the industry. So here's someone who's thinking about the ways in which a problem might spill over, at least in some kind of local setting, versus be a bit more contained. One other example comes from someone who argued that slave labor or child labor is always wrong, that is morally objectionable, and should not be accepted by anyone, no matter what. So what we did was we started inductively just working through about 1,800 of these open-ended responses, 20% of the total, and trying to develop a coding scheme to make sense of the ways in which people understood the relevance and severity and potential spillovers of these kinds of problems. And what we ended up with was a focus on what March and Olson have called a distinction between a logic of consequences and a logic of appropriateness, where a logic of consequences is one in which people are evaluating the expected costs and harms, concrete harms that might come from, in our case, a global problem, a distant problem. Whereas a logic of appropriateness is one in which people are evaluating a problem using a kind of normative or explicitly moral language that's divorced from an evaluation of concrete harms. And we found that this actually helped us to organize some of the different kind of vocabularies that people used in talking about these problems. So as an example of logic of consequences, people talked about the ways in which problems can produce health problems, can hurt people, can maim them. This person actually went on to say, as if this wasn't bad enough, that if they're hurt at work, then they won't be able to feed their families. So there's kind of a double logic of consequences that this person is actually mobilizing in this case. They talked about some problems being more dangerous than others. In some cases, they applied a logic of consequences to a global arena, not just a local one. And in other cases, they applied this logic of consequences to a sense that this problem would spill over to harm them as Americans, either as workers or in some cases as consumers. This person argued that low wages and wage theft abroad would have the effect of lowering wages in the US for American workers. So there's variation within this logic of consequences, to be sure, in terms of whether people are thinking about themselves, about some kind of global community, or about victims at the point of production. In contrast, some people simply talked about these decisions through a logic of appropriateness in which they didn't really specify consequences, but they often did use explicit moral terminology to say that child labor is immoral and disgusting, or to mobilize a frame like a fair wage for your labor, or a statement of that it's inappropriate for companies to profit and steal from their workforce at the same time, or simply to say it's majorly wrong in my book if this sort of thing happens. So what we just
Tim, can
yeah
you just tell a bit more how
Yeah.
you classify something as a moral statement like that?
yeah.
Stealing, is that a moral statement?
So what? So no. What we so let me say, all of these are potentially moral statements. What we did was think about non-consequentialist moral statements being ones that used what's commonly thought of as moral language of right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil. And we developed a kind of working dictionary of these terms that didn't also specify that it's bad for your health, or that it keeps you from being able to have a decent income or have enough food to live on, right? And so what we find in this logic of appropriateness category are lots of people that say it's wrong, it's disgusting, it should never happen, it should simply be prohibited without drawing on a kind of consequentialist logic. If they said stealing on its own doesn't make this a moral frame. What we're seeing in this case is a kind of normative evaluation that it's unfair or wrong if one party is doing very well and the other party is facing some kind of injustice here. All right, so what we discovered ultimately, which was certainly not expected going in, and I think is an intriguing finding that I've been a little obsessed with since then, is that these logic of consequences and appropriateness are distributed unevenly across the different problems in our studies. So, yeah. Should I go back?
I mean, was there no discussion in the justifications about, the effectiveness of state intervention? Maybe it wouldn't help these people because they would lose their jobs, or that sort of thing.
Surprisingly little in the U.S. study, a little bit more from what we've started to see in the German study, although we haven't done the open-ended coding yet. I was surprised that very few people said, will this really help or will it actually hurt? It almost never came up. That is, I think what we saw in part was that people's, the way that they processed the conditions that we showed them was really just sort of like, is it a big concern or not a big concern? And if it's a big concern, then something should be done about it. And there were some people that thought about, we did have a code for like the practical feasibility of the regulation. So there were some people who said, well, I don't think it's really going to work to try to ban this one, but this other one might be easier, so we should do that. And that was actually a little bit more common than people saying, I think the regulation will backfire. I forget the percentage. It's a small percentage. Maybe I have it on a slide back here. I think it's about 3% or something like that that did talk about the practicality of it. Child labor, modern slavery, and unpaid wages were talked about more commonly through a logic of appropriateness than a logic of consequences. That is, people talked about, they used explicit moral terminology and mobilized norms of fairness more often than they brought consequentialist rationales of health and well-being in talking about child labor, modern slavery, and unpaid wages. But even more striking is what happens on the right side of this diagram, which is there's essentially no use of a logic of appropriateness to talk about any of the environmental problems in our study. So when people talked about water pollution, talked about banning products that were contributing to water pollution, overuse of natural resources, illegal use of natural resources, or the emission of toxic chemicals, they justified those decisions almost exclusively through some type of logic of consequences. Some of those you might think would have to do with health, but others, like overuse of natural resources, may not have as direct a link to health as something like water pollution or toxic emissions. And I should say there were different ways. They didn't all use the same rationale, but they all used this general kind of consequentialist approach. Not all, but they far more often used this consequentialist approach in talking about the environmental problems. The big question that this leaves, and I'll come back to this at the end, is, well, why don't we have a logic of appropriateness? Or why wasn't there a kind of readily available moral language of appropriateness or inappropriateness or moral objectionability for the externalization of environmental problems? After all, what global supply chains do is externalize the environmental problems that our consumption is, as affluent consumers, is pushing on to poor people in other parts of the world. You might think that we would see that as an unfair kind of situation. And in fact, many scholars have written about it as an unfair kind of situation, but it's not how ordinary Americans talked about the reasons to intervene in those problems.
Quick question. What's the difference between unpaid wages and wage theft?
Yeah, it's just a framing difference. So in our mind, there shouldn't be a difference. It's just it's this illegality frame applied to a labor problem, not just an environmental problem, which turned out not to work, by the way. We can come back to that if you want. The illegality frame did work for the environmental problem, but not for the labor problem, for reasons we're not entirely sure of. All right, so let me quickly sum up what we found in the U.S., and then I'll take 10 minutes to tell you about the German study and wrap up. So a subset of both labor and environmental problems, that is, it's not just labor or just environment, it's a subset of each of these sets of problems that clearly heightens interest in state intervention, whereas some other problems like unpaid wages and maybe most notably overuse of natural resources don't provoke much interest in state intervention. But the justifications seem to take different forms for different problems, particularly environmental problems being associated strongly with this logic of appropriateness. Of course, we also find evidence that corporate assurances reduce the perceived importance of state intervention for basically all groups and regardless of the credibility of those statements, as usually conceptualized at least. And advocacy frames do matter, but much more inconsistently and fairly slightly in comparison. All right. Then we took a similar study to Germany, a different national context in which we thought some of these problems and statements might resonate differently. Because in the German context in general, there is a lower average level of trust in companies and higher trust in advocacy organizations and experts. So these are just averages from the World Values Survey, the most recent data we could get. Germans have less trust in major companies than Americans do. They actually have less trust in major companies than any other country that we can find, any other European country, any other affluent country at least. And so they're quite skeptical of companies, so we might expect them to be less responsive to these corporate assurances of private regulation. And they're more trusting of environmental organizations, unions, and especially universities, potentially also experts, than Americans are. So we might expect them to be more responsive to advocacy statements and maybe also just to think about the severity and importance and relevance of these problems in slightly different ways. So we did a very similar study, another conjoint survey experiment, this one about a year later, using a national sample of about 3,500 respondents with the same outcome, the perceived importance of state intervention, in this case the German government, imposing a ban on the sales of a product that's linked to one of these types of problems. And we had similar treatments in our experiment. We changed a couple of things. We added a location dimension where we showed people the country in which it was occurring, in part to see if proximity to Germany played any role. And we changed the business and NGO statements slightly to resonate more fully with the German context, and also to further test this idea about moral statements resonating with some problems more than others. So here's what it looked like in the German context, although translated into English. Again, we showed people a scenario in this kind of bullet point form, a little bit like reading a newspaper article, in this case about modern slave labor at suppliers in Morocco. And then we showed them a comparative table, the Moroccan situation with a situation of unpaid wages in the production of clothing in Thailand. And again, we asked them to choose in which situation would you most want the German state to intervene, and again, to what extent, how supportive, how much would you support or oppose intervention in each of those cases. So here, same sort of presentation of the results, except I'm going to split it up a little bit just to make it a little easier to see. Here are, once again, predominantly negative effects of corporate assurances on the perceived importance of state intervention. That is, even in a context in which people generally have low trust in corporations, comparatively speaking, less trust in corporations than Americans and most other countries, they still defer to these kinds of corporate promises of reform. That included one that was kind of tailored to the German social partnership model in an era of globalization, as well as this strict new rules kind of unilateral statement, and again, our NGO partnership statement, which should seemingly have more credibility, mattered to basically the same degree as these other statements. Even the pro-social language resonated to some degree in the German context. There's slightly greater response to advocacy frames. So for instance, when advocacy organizations said we shouldn't trust companies to solve such an important problem, it's really the government's job, that did boost support for state intervention, and it didn't produce the backlash that it had in the US, even among conservatives. Our new statement here, where we tried to push this language of morality and see if that would also boost interest in state intervention, didn't really matter. That is, the effect here is just barely significant for prioritization, but not quite significant for the degree of support. You might be wondering if it matters which kinds of issues, which kinds of problems people are concerned, people are looking at. And the results here are a little bit, I'm not sure quite what to make of these, because if we separate these out by problems, when considering labor problems, this morality statement or immorality statement did actually matter for the degree of support, but it also worked for environmental problems, but only for the prioritization. So things are a little bit messy here, and this is one of the things hopefully we can get at through the open-ended responses. Despite Germany being in many ways a different national context, the relative importance of the problems in this study were almost exactly the same. That is, these same four problems stick out. Child labor, modern slavery to a somewhat less extent in Germany, and emission of toxic chemicals and water pollution provoked the greatest interest in state intervention. Natural resource overuse still doesn't provoke much, and in this case, the illegality frame, talking about it as illegal overuse, didn't make a difference. We added countries here in part to see if those that were a bit more proximate to Germany would produce different levels of interest in state intervention. And for the most part, they don't. The only real effect we find here is a somewhat surprising negative effect of Turkey. I think this has something to do with the complicated relationship between Germany and Turkey. Even if we control for people who have a migration background, that effect persists. But in any case, for the most part, country doesn't make a difference. There's not much interest in punishing China any more harshly than any other country, as you might expect in the midst of geopolitical tensions, but also no greater interest in dealing with problems in Morocco or Turkey than in more distant locations. So this is not the only way to operationalize the distance of the problems, but this was our attempt and basically didn't produce anything. Now, we haven't yet coded the open-ended justifications in the German sample. We did the same thing. We asked people to explain their choice, and we've gone through them, but we haven't systematically coded them yet. But I wanted to share a couple of examples translated roughly into English here that suggest that this same distinction between a logic of appropriateness and logic of consequences may actually be happening in the German context as well. So we similarly see these kinds of blanket prohibitions on problems of modern slavery and child labor, and consequentialist rationales when it comes to environmental problems, in this case, when it comes to toxic chemicals, whether that's talking about danger or presumably affecting people's health by spreading them in the air. So,
sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
There should be no. Isn't that a logic of appropriateness?
Yeah, on second thought, I think this one actually is both. The reason I put it down here is the dangerous part, but it is a blanket prohibition, right? So this is actually maybe an interesting mixture of the two. And to be honest, I'm not sure how well, if our distinction will fully hold up as we code all the German responses or not. So hopefully the ideas that we generate today can actually help us develop a useful coding scheme here. All right. I want to wrap up by first with a reminder of what I think we've found, and then some questions that have been bothering me or that I've been stuck with. So first, I think we found pretty solid evidence that corporate assurances of private regulation shape perceptions of state intervention in different contexts and for different types of people. Even in the German context, people with different political views or different views of regulation in general responded to corporate statements in similar ways. That is, they deferred to corporations and saw it as less important to have the state intervene when companies were willing to do something. We think this reflects not necessarily a deep trust in corporations, but some kind of pragmatic deference to corporations as sort of authoritative and powerful actors in global supply chains. We found different types of justifications that can underlie concern about distant problems. Some people did use a sort of universalistic language of this problem harming all of us or harming the planet as a whole, primarily for environmental, but also occasionally for the spillover of labor abuses on labor markets in the US or in Germany. Some people worried mainly about the victims and particularly the material and health harms that would come to them for experiencing these problems. But other people used a language of morality, of explicit language of something being wrong or inappropriate without necessarily designating or discussing the concrete consequences of that. And so there's a range of different things, right? There's, I think, different, what we would think of as different moral vocabularies that are provoked by the conditions that we're showing people. But there's some clustering of those, right? Different problems seem to evoke different justifications. That is, environmental problems seem strongly associated with a logic of consequences and not a logic of appropriateness. So here are the three questions I want to leave us with. First, it seems to us that there's the lack of a kind of popular moral vocabulary that takes a deontological approach, that is a non-consequentialist approach to discussing the externalization of environmental problems. It's striking that the language of fairness, immorality, and wrongness was almost never used by respondents, at least in the US, to discuss the environmental problems in global supply chains. Why might that be the case? Well, we think, with some help from reviewer 2, or reviewer 3, I think it was, that there might be something about the way in which environment, labor, justice, and justice have evolved, have co-evolved in political spheres that sort of has shaped the way people attach different vocabularies to particular problems. That is, we've come to understand the experience of injustice, including not being paid, being forced to work, having children be forced to work, as an injustice that's morally problematic, that easily cues a kind of language of right and wrong. And we've come to think of a problem of natural resource overuse, emissions, water pollution, through a different lens that may not be less powerful, but is different and is one more closely linked to science and more closely linked to some kind of estimation of health harms and harms to our well-being. That may not be the only answer. I'm interested in your thoughts on, I'd love to get your thoughts on why we're seeing this clustering of logics. It could also be that we're just asking about the wrong problems, or we're asking about a specific set of problems that occur in global supply chains, but this kind of clustering of environmental with consequentialism and labor with non-consequentialist, to a lesser extent, logics may not be generalizable. I'm not sure, and again, I'd love to get your thoughts on whether this could be extended, and if so, how. Finally, if we're right, if it's true that people use different kinds of popular moral logics or moral lenses to understand labor and environmental problems, then this might pose a problem for policies that try to merge labor and environmental concerns. Most notably in the current context, green industrial policy that tries to bring together concerns about climate change and deindustrialization and reindustrialization and social justice to produce some more prosperous future. It could be that we have the clash of different logics in terms of how these kinds of policy proposals are being perceived or would be perceived that might have political consequences. So thanks so much for your attention and your comments. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. So then the question and answer period. First half hour will be recorded. And for those of you online, you should use the chat function to indicate that you want to ask a question. And as we are a mix of researchers from different fields, please also tell us your area of study so we can mix people from different disciplines. And you can also ask follow-up questions, and then you write follow-up to the person who just asked a question. And you can also do follow-ups here by putting up your finger. So let me see where I should start here. Actually, first is Julia.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Tim. That was very interesting. So I wanted to ask about the justifications that you found in the qualitative results of the study. And you seem to be puzzled or somehow affected by the fact that water pollution, toxic emissions, and overuse of natural resources, the justification is more related to this, like what you call logic of appropriateness. And it seems like Revere 2 already gave you some reasons for why that might be the case. So I was thinking maybe me as a moral philosopher could give you others. So I'm not surprised by that. And I think that when I'm thinking about the like contemporary literature on environmental ethical theory, for example. So, I think there is a fair agreement there that water or just natural resources in general have instrumental value. There's less agreement about whether they have intrinsic value, and I think that might be driving people's intuitions there. So I think there's a clear distinction there between the value that people ascribe or tend to ascribe to these environmental resources and the value that people would ascribe to children or like personhood in general. So my question is whether your claim is that people should think about these things in this like deontic logic, and if so, like if you could give some examples of how those justifications would look like or sound like.
So one reason, like normatively, why you might want people to take a sort of fairness approach to environmental problems that are distant, is that some of them don't have really clear consequences for me as an observer. Some do, right? But if a local water source in a village in China is polluted by virtue of for the manufacturing of my smartphone, like that doesn't really affect me. If the oceans are polluted, maybe that affects me. So if we think that that's a concerning problem, then we need people, I think, to view it as a problem of unfairness, not just a problem of health consequences, or we need them to link the health consequences of that problem to a sense that it's unfair for me to profit, for me to benefit from the pollution that's pushed onto others. I wouldn't make that case strongly on my own, but this is, I think, the case that some scholars of global supply chains have argued, which is if what global supply chains do is to distance us from the consequences of our production, then what the job of advocacy organizations is to bridge those distances and make us see those problems in ways that we would if they were closer to us. And I think from my intuition is that if the problems were closer, you would actually see it as a bit more unfair. That's not a perfect answer, but I think that's why it's sort of not just it's not just descriptively interesting to me. It's sort of normatively interesting to me that vocabulary is not there.
Yeah, no, so I just have to follow up this because I think I understand what you get at sometimes, but I'm not sure. So the idea, like somebody is polluting a river in another country far away. Okay, it doesn't affect me directly, but it affects other human beings, and that seems to be enough to think it's wrong. So, and this talk about consequences, then is that your argument was they talk more about the what you call a language of consequences.
Yeah. So.
So I'm a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say, as far as we're going in the paper, is to say, it's a little bit unexpected that these two languages are used in such distinctive ways. I guess I would say, from a normative perspective, my intuition is still that it's sort of concerning to me if only one kind of moral frame can be mobilized or can be used to understand that problem, right? Whereas, so take the example of child labor. So even though child labor was mostly understood through what we call the logic of appropriateness, people said it's simply wrong for kids to have to be employed. Some of them, a little bit surprisingly, also said, here are the reasons why it's wrong. Because kids don't get to learn, They don't get to have the normal child developmental things. They don't get to go to school. They actually supplemented a kind of statement about inappropriateness with a statement of consequences. And we just didn't see that for the environmental problems.
Because many, a very common view that people have, you can divide people up, and some people think that what makes an action wrong is the consequences. So they're just so very clear. They use the language, it's wrong with child labor, but the reason it's being wrong is because of all of these consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, so it's a little concerning to me if there's only one. I mean, people view what's right and wrong through different lenses, right? Some take a more consequentialist approach than others. That's my I'm treading in dangerous territory here, I realize, as the sociologist in the room. But so it seems like you would want different language. If you're concerned about a problem, you would want there to be different languages that are available to people to talk about it, right? So that if you viewed it through a consequentialist lens, you would be able to do that. But if you tended to view problems through a kind of, this action is either right or wrong, regardless of whether the kid is benefiting from having a job or the kid's family is benefiting from having a job, which almost no one talked about, by the way, then you would want there to be another vocabulary.
But I don't think you have evidence that they think it's wrong, that the wrongness is just independent of the consequences. You don't get that from your material.
I think we do, actually, in the fact that child labor and modern slavery, for instance, are the most, they're the problems that provoke the most interest in state intervention, and they're also the ones that are most understood through this logic of appropriateness.
Yeah, but what you get is the information. They want more state intervention, and people say directly it's just wrong. It's wrong, or something like that. But it might be that they think it's wrong is because of the consequences. And you didn't ask any question, as far as I understand, that made you be able to discern whether that is the reason why you think that it's wrong.
So that's definitely true. I guess what I would say is what we're measuring here is like the language that people use to talk about the problem, not the full thought process. We'd love to have, if they spelled out every step in the thought process, that would be great, but they don't do that, right? I guess, yeah, I mean, maybe it comes down to a question of whether you think the language is important or whether you really want the full thought process behind it. We don't have the full thought process, that's for sure.
So a follow-up question from Joseph.
Yes, thanks a lot for this super talk. But so I like the reviewer's suggestion about this evolution of vocabulary somehow, and that sort of could look at it from a Marshallian perspective. Now, first you have property rights that get protected, then like democratic or political rights, and then welfare state rights, which would be like all this like child labor stuff, and we are not yet at the environmental rights in our. But then I thought, like, if you look at the 1970s, and so I mean, when you look at Germany and the US, where a time where all this production was locally based here, and you had very big environmental consequences. So maybe you find this language in the 1970s, also in Germany or in the US, to describe the so I mean, Klaus Töpfer, in the 80s, there was the German Minister for the Environment, and he himself, he had to swim through the Rhine, the big river, to show that now you can do it again. So I mean, that there have been like the environmental disasters here as well, with direct consequences from production without the supply chains. And I wonder if you go back with the historical approach, whether you could find the answers.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I can't quite decide how much I can do this study versus just hoping that someone else does it. I mean, in the U.S., so I appreciate the suggestion. In the U.S., the big counterexample is the environmental justice movement, which has, to some degree, in a domestic context, reframed problems of environmental harm into problems of inequality and justice. And this is part of the reason why it's sort of striking to us that wasn't really, I mean, we didn't try to cue that for people. We didn't ask them, what do you think about environmental justice in a global context? But the fact that no one kind of raised it on their own, I think is sort of telling. So, yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to go back. I mean, maybe especially in our two cases, to go back and see as production is being globalized and shift and during an era where many of these products were produced domestically, and the environmental movement was rising at that same point, what was the discourse around environment versus labor rights? Thanks.
Folke? Or did you have a follow-up?
I just wanted to say that as a follow-up. I do think that, many years ago when I was studying history of ideas, I know that I did read a book about, the history of how during the Enlightenment, how this notion developed about nature being something for humans to conquer, and this really instrumental value sort of approach. I do think that maybe someone has done this in the past.
Okay, I'm just going to add that there was someone in this audience, I'm not sure he's still here, who has proven that all deontological theories are really versions of consequentialism. so it's a tricky area. But
You thinking about Christer?
yes,
He didn't prove that.
no, I was joking. Obviously not.
It's true, actually.
But I had another question. So I would like there to be a support for strong global governance institutions, and that's where I'm coming from, basically. And the question is, some of this resistance against state interventions, do you think it had anything to do with some sort of collective action problem, or tragedy of the commons problem, or free riding problem? Perhaps people thought that we can ban it, but then we are also going to be harmed because we can't use these products or whatever. Other nations are going to do that instead. So given that situation, I'm not for state intervention. But if there had been some mechanism that would ensure that every state would have the same types of regulations, then I would be for it. Do you think there might be some such mechanism here?
So what I would say, based on the evidence we've collected, is that in actual policy making and in policy entrepreneurship and in the reasons that states do or don't adopt policies, I think that's central, right? Collective action problems and the fear of governments that if they are a first mover, they will disadvantage themselves and their businesses. We don't see a lot of evidence of that in how people respond to these scenarios. And I think,
did you look for it?
we did not ask that specifically. No, we basically wanted to. So we decided that if we want that the scenarios were complicated, and we needed the policy outcome to be very simple, and that's why a ban works nicely, because it's very intuitive to say what the government can do is say can't sell it, right? It's not we're going to have a negotiation between two countries and decide on a set of standards. There's so much in actual regulatory politics that's complicated and hard to convey in a survey like this. So we decided to complicate the scenarios, but make the policy option very, very simple. And but still, you might say, if people might be concerned that if we ban this product, actually, they should have been more concerned about consumer welfare, I think, than about disadvantaging their national economy, given the products that we're looking at. Like what we're saying is, should we ban clothing from being that's linked to child labor from being sold in the U.S.? Should we ban electronics linked to water pollution from being sold in the U.S.? But I think the deeper answer to your question is, we did not try to explore all possible ways that people thought about regulation and when it's good and when it's not. But we did, through the open-ended responses, try to just see what came up, right? We're going to give you a simple thing. We're going to give you a simple prompt, and then allow you to talk about it. And nobody talked about that. Almost nobody talked about that, which is just another way of saying I think people's policy preferences in this area are not super well formed. I think they're responding to our scenarios not with a theory of regulation and global change or global governance. They're responding with a kind of lay theory of like, well, is that a problem for me? Or there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world. Maybe that's not the one that we need to take action on, whereas maybe this other one is. And so I think all of the language, all the open-ended responses that we got really need to be interpreted with that.
But
in
maybe
mind.
you can educate them a little bit. And at least, I mean, it would be interesting to see an attempt to try to more conclusively explore that issue. And that's my view.
I mean, I think the thing that the other agenda that comes out of this is to see, we obviously don't know we're just measuring perceptions, right? We don't know how that affects people's political behavior, whether that affects their voting preferences at all, whether that affects the kinds of things they expect domestic representatives to take up or not. Again, I'm not sure we can do this, but it would be an important next step to think about how these kinds of preferences or sentiments might translate into real policy change. The US at the current point in time provides kind of and maybe Europe too, provides an interesting, maybe useful place for doing this, because, I mean, if I were giving this talk 10 years ago, everyone would have said, well, there's no bans. No one's banning these products. That's protectionism. You can't do that. The WTO says that's illegitimate. But since then, the U.S. has banned a bunch of items from coming into the country due to forced labor. Europe is about to do the same, in part because some of the boats that got diverted from Malaysia, forced labor, rubber gloves made with forced labor in Malaysia, were sent to Europe. They were rejected, sent to the U.S. They were rejected, and they came to Europe, which then led to this wave of a kind of policy entrepreneurship to do something similar here. But the point is, I think there is now like a politics of this kind of global regulation through product bans. And it has reached the public consciousness primarily through Xinjiang and through the slaughter and the repression of Uyghur people in Xinjiang, which now combines these moral concerns about exploitation and human rights with nationalism and concerns about China's rise to power. And since the invasion of Ukraine, I don't even know that adds a whole other geopolitical element here. But there would be, I think, opportunities for getting at how these kind of pools of sentiment that we're measuring get mobilized by policy entrepreneurs to create real political change.
Moa.
Yeah, so thank you. This was really interesting. I have several questions, but I'm going to pose one of them now and then maybe another one later. So I was thinking about, I do think that you're right that we are lacking this moral vocabulary, but I do think that maybe we don't lack all of it. So it could be like a framing problem. Let's say, for instance, that people tend to think that nature has no intrinsic value, but some animals have. Maybe not all animals, but some, like cute Chinese pandas or gorillas in the rainforest, or even perhaps that the rainforest might have intrinsic value because there's this romantic idea about the rainforest. People tend to be upset when they see, we don't care about some boring forest in Russia, but we care about the rainforest, right? Or some boring forest in Sweden for that matter. So maybe, that one way to move forward could be to sort of test other cases where you frame them as, concerning some cute animals or some rainforest or something like that, to see if we lack, to maybe narrow down where we lack a moral vocabulary. It might not be for all of nature, so to speak. So I think it could be both that we have this lack of moral vocabulary, but we don't completely lack it. We lack it for some parts maybe of nature.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, that's one of the goals of this project that Malcolm and Julia and I have been talking about, especially on the question of how animals and different types of animals might be perceived. So thanks. I appreciate the idea.
Can I follow up? Like snakes. No, I mean, but I was wondering the whole time, you did not do it product specific, the survey?
We did. And we randomized the products. So it's either clothing, electronics, or seafood.
Yeah, but it's not like the iPhone.
No.
because maybe electronics okay, but without the iPhone I can't do it.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't want to get too specific and have people's, brand preferences shape their views of this. We did, in the U.S. study, we did name particular companies, but we needed them to be companies that sold all of these things. So we named Walmart and Target as basically the only two very well-known companies that could plausibly sell apparel, electronics, and seafood. And we dropped that in the German study. So I guess my theory would be, if you tie this to brands, then people might feel less excited about giving up their favorite brand. But I don't think the sort of relative rating of the products or the statements would necessarily change. At least I don't see a reason why they would.
Very good. Next on the list is me. Could you go back to that slide you had with the results from the US study? Just
That, yeah?
no, it should be
the actual results.
yeah, exactly.
This
that.
one or?
Yeah, that one. Okay. So I think this is tricky in many ways to explain these differences. But one thing is that could affect it is how identifiable the victim is, or how clear the victim is. And I mean, it would be a kind of hypothesis that when child labor, you think, oh, there's a clear victim there, there's child, and modern slavery, there's a clear victim there. And then when you come to, overuse of natural resources and toxic chemicals, it's very unclear who the victim is.
Yeah.
It's like but we know that people's this kind of identification does affect both people's moral motivation, and I think it might also affect how they speak about it. So that would be another, I'm doing philosophy on my feet, or sociology on my feet here, hypothesis why you see these differences.
And this is another dimension that I've thought about trying to extend in other work, which is the way I would think about it is sort of so I, and to some extent Malcolm and Julie and I have been kind of playing with this notion of distance and thinking about different dimensions of distance, some of which are geographical, some temporal. But you could also think about a kind of social distance, right, where you might be able to identify a particular victim, and you might even be able to, in a study, kind of shape whether the observer sees that victim as being similar to them or quite different from them, right? And the argument, I think, would be, my expectation would be, if the victim is seen as similar to the observer in some respect, then there would be more interest in dealing with the problem. If the victim is seen, even if there is a victim, if the victim is seen as being socially very distant as well as geographically very distant, doesn't mean people can't care, but I think they would care less. I think you're also saying, well, in some cases the victims might be nameless and faceless, right? And they might be collectivities. Yeah, it's a great
victim.
It's a great idea. So if we can,
no victim too.
if we can do the sort of massive new round of survey experiments on this, I think it's a good idea to try to incorporate that.
Pretty well here that you have in all the other cases that you have some kind of human being directly being affected, but on the right hand you don't.
Yeah.
Is that right? I mean, but people talked a lot about, I mean, I understand what you're saying with modern slavery and child labor. It's like the very naming of the problem it kind of implies a victim. But people did, when they talked about water pollution, for instance, or emission of toxic chemicals, they did imagine a human victim. They said, I wouldn't want to be, I certainly wouldn't want to be surrounded by a place that was emitting a lot of toxic chemicals. That seems like a bad problem. You can't just not breathe.
Okay,
right?
So you have other evidence that we haven't seen that the people were thinking about some.
Well, people thought lots of different things. Some people did that, yes. And conversely, I would say when you think of a problem like unpaid wages, I'm not sure, does that connote a victim as much as...
the person who should have gotten the wage is clearly a victim, directly. So, whereas, I mean, it connects to some problems that Volker was talking about. For example, some kind of pollution, you don't make a big difference, he doesn't make a big difference, but together we make a big difference. So it's a bit unclear whether...
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I should say, so this is really useful, and we started this project by choosing the problems. We chose the problems based on kind of what's actually going on in global supply chains. What are the common problems that would give us some comparative leverage? We hadn't fully theorized, and I don't think we had the literature that would help us to fully theorize like what the problems should be. Now, and in many ways, we were focused mainly on the corporate and advocacy statements when we started the project. And now kind of where I'm headed is I'm kind of tired of the corporate and advocacy statements in some ways. I think we've got pretty solid evidence on that. But these questions about how the problems are named and understood are, I think, really, really intriguing to me. So this is certainly an important dimension I think we could think further about.
Good. Next is Tim.
Yeah, so my comment was actually similar to Gustav's. So I had a very similar thought. And just to respond to one of the things you said in response to Gustav, so you said that when people, when you ask people why they had an opinion on the environmental issues, they would often like bring up victims or point to victims and things like that. But it might still matter that on the things like child labor, modern slave labor, the victim is kind of implicit in the description versus not in the other cases. For example, maybe that explains why people felt more of a need to point to such a victim, right? Because it wasn't included in the description. So maybe one thing you could try is like including like descriptions of people, but like horrible things happening to people when they drink the water, and see if that makes a difference. The one kind of outlier though that you wouldn't expect is the difference between unpaid wages and wage theft. Like it seems like if anything, if we were thinking about an identifiable victim, like wage theft should look more like unpaid wages, and the red box should be even higher. Yeah. But so I don't know what's going on there.
I mean, wage theft. So these are basically, there's no difference. There's also significant difference there.
Yeah.
Wage theft is a little bit messy throughout. And because it actually worked the opposite way that we hypothesized. Mm-hmm. People became less supportive of a ban when it was described as wage theft than when it was described as unpaid wages.
Yeah.
And we're a little puzzled as to why that might be. We went through the open-ended responses. There are a few people that were actually confused about what we meant by wage theft. And then we started to wonder if that language is just not actually very clear to people. Like that's a language that's being used in activist circles, especially in the US right now. And it's, I think, explicitly an attempt to bring a kind of criminological frame to a sort of mundane workplace problem. Mm-hmm. But our results make us wonder if it's actually really makes sense to people who aren't already in those circles.
Yeah. Can I ask one quick question? So another question I had is, so I was thinking when you distinguish the logic of consequences from the logic of appropriateness, the first thing I thought is, what are you going to do with responses that have both moral language and a language of consequences? But you sort of answered that a little bit. And I wondered if...
but there just weren't very many of them.
Oh, there weren't very many of them. Okay, because one of my questions was going to be like what proportion of for things like water pollution and toxic chemicals, what proportion of like the green bar had moral language? Because that might be an interesting thing to know. Because you said in your talk that you when you had a statement that had both moral language and used terms like hurt, suffer, what you dubbed like a consequentialist reasoning, you put it, you classified it as under a logic of consequences. So then that raises the question of like how much of the logic of consequences responses had moral language.
Yeah, actually what we would do, I mean, the codes aren't mutually exclusive, so we could do it both ways. It could be coded for both consequences and appropriateness, but that was pretty rare. But it certainly is possible that some of these people, I could look this up. I don't have the result.
Okay, so that mixed category isn't represented here, or?
Let me think. So the mixed category, if the mixed category, so these are I'd have to look back. You know, I think because the codes were not mutually exclusive, there are some responses that used multiple codes, multiple logics, that would simply be included twice here in essence.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Okay.
I'm certain that that is not driving the pattern because it's a relatively small number out of the total.
Okay.
We do have a different figure where, like, basically each of these is made up of 4 other more specific codes, and not a different paper. We have a different figure that disaggregates those, where you can see, but I didn't put it on the slides, unfortunately, where you can see the disaggregated version, and that would then show you the cases where there's multiple things happening at the same time.
On that note, final note, join me and thank the speaker for this lovely talk. And let me mention what's coming up. March 23rd, Jean Terrell, Commitments and Bargaining Delays in Parliamentary Democracies. And March 30th, Maria Oyola, Hope in the Face of Climate Change, Wishful Thinking, where an extension must. And April 6th, this is relevant to this talk, Social Norms and Meta-Norms in 57 countries. Very welcome then. Thank you.